I'd like to welcome on screen our kickoff panel featuring Mathias Cormann, the Secretary General of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in a virtual fireside chat with Ambassador Kristen Silverberg, the President and COO of Business Roundtable and the former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. If you registered as a guest today, you should have received a copy of today's event program by email. In your program, you'll find the full agenda for the conference and biographies for all our guests, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. Both the Secretary General and Ambassador Silverberg are newcomers to the WITC stage, and we're delighted to host both of you today. There are so many areas of the economy that the OECD has been actively leading, from international tax and trade to the environment and COVID recovery. Of course, all areas that the BRT is also active and interested in. We have a ton to cover in a short amount of time, so thanks to both of you for joining us. Kristen?
Good to be here. So much, Ken. Mr. Secretary General, it's an honor to be with you today and with the entire WITC community, including a number of Business Roundtable members. So thanks so much for joining. As Ken was saying, there are infinite number of topics we could cover today, but I thought we could start with something that's at the heart of the WITC mandate, which is the health of the international trading system. Can you just say a word? How do you assess the health of the system in 2022? And what do you think of the key challenges and threats?
Well, thank you very much. Well, I mean, obviously, firstly, right now, there are a whole range of challenges that are directly related to the pandemic that we see. I mean, these include disruptions in international supply chains, a proliferation of export restrictions. I mean, if we look at supply disruptions, for example, in terms of semiconductors, that has knocked about 1% of US GDP in 2021. So improving supply chain resilience is really going to be critically important moving forward. And at the OECD, we're certainly doing our bit. We're working to help build more resilient value chains by helping countries to keep markets open, essentially. And there's a whole range of tools there, including, of course, facilitating cooperation and having better bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral arrangements in place. But the pandemic has also shown the importance of limiting the introduction of export restrictions during crises. The agricultural market information system, Market Monitor, quite a mouthful, but it has been a key platform for sharing knowledge and encouraging countries to refrain from imposing export restrictions during the pandemic. And what we've seen here is that, unlike in previous crises, food supply chains kept flowing and shortages weren't certainly at least not exacerbated. The second set of challenges were there before the crisis, and I mean, they really relate to the design of our multilateral trading system. A rules-based trading system in good working order is obviously very important, and that also, among other things, requires an effective dispute resolution process, and I mean, that is an ongoing and unresolved conversation internationally that we do believe that needs to be brought to a conclusion. It also includes the need to define what is an acceptable level of government support in a market. Governments, in the context of the pandemic, have rightly supported sectors that were negatively impacted by the pandemic. But what we see now is that the need to ensure stimulus responses risks entrenching the trade distortions, and that is something that ought to be avoided because, I mean, entrenching trade distortions, including in relation to excess capacity, of course, is not something that would be beneficial for the global economy moving forward. And the OECD is monitoring and providing advice in relation to these issues. And finally, on this aspect, we're also monitoring and measuring subsidies across agriculture, fisheries, fossil fuels, and industrial sectors to support the work that's being done through the WTO in relation to these practices. Our work in this particular area has led to some striking findings that I thought that you might find interesting. For example, globally, public support to agriculture between 2018 and 2020 reached a staggering $720 billion US annually. And we've also revealed the nature and scale of government support in the aluminium and semiconductor sectors, causing distortions there. And we've highlighted that support for below market finance is prevalent in 13 key industrial sectors, which is exacerbating excess capacity and creating distortions in some of those sectors. And further, we've been able to expose a level of competitive neutrality issues, showing that businesses with more than 25% government ownership invariably receive market distorting government support. And that skews private investment decisions and consequently reduces growth opportunities. Many issues there in the whole broader trading space. But I mean, overall, of course, global trade has held up quite well during the pandemic. It's just the supply chain disruptions that have obviously caused issues that need to be resolved moving forward.
Great, thank you. Ken mentioned a lot of the overlap between the OECD and Business Roundtable issues. One key area of overlap are the trade and supply chain issues you mentioned, but another big one is the global tax regime. You know very well that Congress has been debating the president's Build Back Better plan, including changes to GILTI. Negotiations on that may have stalled. It's not clear. What do you think the impact is on the OECD's process if Congress fails to enact legislation?
Well, firstly, our focus has been on reaching an international agreement to make our tax system, our international tax arrangements fairer and work better in a digitalized, globalized world economy. And of course, we are working to support those who have agreed in implementing that deal that is, in the US and all around the world. And at this stage, when it comes to Pillar 1 in particular, which is the one that appears to be getting a lot of focus in the US context, I would have thought that it's in the best interest of those major multinational players, including in particular out of the US, to be able to work within one consistent, globally agreed set of rules, rather than to face a proliferation of unilateral measures from countries all around the world where there is perceived inequities and perceived issues of fairness when it comes to the way the tax system internationally operates. Look, I mean, I'm hopeful and quietly optimistic that in the end, when all of the I's have been dotted and T's have been crossed, that people in the US that get to make these decisions along the way will overwhelmingly see that it's in the interest both of business in the US and of the global economy, in which the US, of course, has got a very significant stake.
And do you, even setting aside the US issues, we've heard from a number of EU countries about concerns about the timeline. Do you think that next January is realistic in terms of implementation of Pillar 2? And if not, do you think there's a possibility of pushing back the timeline and giving countries more time for implementation?
Well, we are sticking to the timeline. I mean, the timeline that was set was very ambitious to have both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 come into effect from 2023 onwards. And we're very happy to see jurisdictions starting the implementation process on both, including in the EU. In the end, it's not for me to comment on the internal deliberations of specific jurisdictions, but we are happy to see that the EU and other jurisdictions around the world are starting the work that needs to be done in order to be able to implement these important international tax reforms from 2023 onwards. I mean, in the UK, they've launched relevant public consultation process. In Switzerland, they've triggered a process to change their constitution to implement a minimum effective tax rate of 15%. And I mean, there really is a lot of serious commitment from countries and jurisdictions around the world. And look, yes, I mean, it's going to be challenging to get there, but I'm quietly optimistic.
How are you engaging business in the process? The business consultations with the OECD can be very valuable. Of course, we at Business Roundtable support them. So what's your sense of how to engage business on?
Look, we are consulting with business quite extensively. I mean, we had a very significant round of public consultation meetings in January 2021, which was an open and public discussions on the then blueprints of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. We received over 3,500 pages of comments from about 200 odd different senior high-level stakeholders across business, civil society, academia. the NGO sector, no lacking of advice and perspectives and suggestions. And since then, of course, we've done our utmost to facilitate a transparent and efficient process, and we do receive regular input on ongoing technical work from the OECD business advisory groups, which were formed specifically to contribute to our work on tax. We're about to launch a public consultation process specifically on the implementation of Pillar 2 model rules in February, and we will soon begin rolling consultations on Pillar 1. So that is, I mean, specifically, and going into a bit of, I guess, technical detail here, we will be releasing working documents on individual building blocks of Pillar 1. First, Amount I, the so-called Amount I, which we will be releasing those documents as they are ready, rather than waiting to release the full final document in one go at the end, and that will allow us to continue to work in parallel on different aspects, and will help us to get to help us to meet the ambitious timetable we hope. And there'll also be some further public consultations later in 2022 on Amount B of Pillar 1 and relevant aspects of, so I mean, there's plenty of work ahead, certainly in terms of public consultation, including and in particular with business.
Yes, you may get some more advice and consultation when we get to the Q&A section with Ken. So thank you for that. I wanted to spend some time talking about climate, which is another issue of shared concern. Business Roundtable has endorsed a price on carbon in the US, but of course, a key theme for us is the need for international coordination. And I know you have pressed on that as well. What do you think OECD's role is in terms of facilitating international cooperation and coordination on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, for example?
Well, I think we have a key role to play. I mean, I think what the missing piece when it comes to ambitious and effective global action on climate change is to have a globally more coherent, better coordinated approach to the pricing of emissions. I mean, in the end, the challenge is how can we lift the level of ambition and effort in individual jurisdictions to the level required to get to global net zero in a way that doesn't, in a way that helps maintain to the greatest extent possible the global level playing field for trade, which minimizes trade distortions and minimizes carbon leakage risk. But in the end, to impose a price on carbon in one jurisdiction in a way that shifts economic activity, jobs, and emissions into other parts of the world, where for the same level of output, emissions are going to be higher, is obviously not a sensible way to go. I mean, you end up harming your domestic economy, putting jobs at risk at the same time as you're increasing global emissions. So the way to really address this is in a way that is genuinely globally coordinated, and where to the extent that different countries, understandably, with different starting positions and different opportunities to make their best contribution, use a different mix of policy levers and tools, we've got to find a better way to integrate all of that, with a view of minimizing trade distortions and minimizing carbon leakage risk. And so in that context, I think the OECD does have a role to play. And what I've suggested what I've suggested to our members and to G20 members is that we seek to replicate the successful inclusive framework approach on international tax to the climate change challenge. Similarly, across the OECD, all OECD member countries share the ambition to get to net zero emissions, broadly by 2050, some slightly later, but broadly by 2050. But there's also an appreciation that in order to address this challenge effectively, it does need to be globally coordinated. And we do have to have other G20 countries that are not member of the OECD part of a multilaterally coordinated approach: China, India, Russia, and others. And we believe that the inclusive framework vehicle on tax has proven quite effective there. Not easy, it took a while, but nevertheless, we were able to get there. And we think that similarly, there would be some advantages and there would be a benefit in pursuing a similar approach on this issue.
Can you say a word about the global economic recovery? The OECD put out its economic outlook report recently, and the OECD economists were cautiously optimistic, but noted a number of risks. One in particular they noticed were imbalances in the recovery based on the different public health situation and vaccination rates around the world. Can you say a word about the imbalances and what ought to be done to address them?
Well, look, our December economic outlook shows that output in most OECD countries has now surpassed its late 2019 level and is converging on its pre-pandemic path. But nonetheless, I mean, you're quite right, lower income economies, particularly those with vaccination rates that are low, are at risk of being left behind. So it's important to note, though, that even though the recovery has been strong and rapid in many areas, it is also uneven, and it's even uneven between advanced economies, depending on the level of vaccination and some other issues. Employment is still relatively weak in the US, but it's already higher than in its pre-pandemic period across the euro area. And at the same time, US GDP has recovered much faster than Europe's GDP. And those divergent recovery paths that we are witnessing are linked to the different approaches, I guess, in the way the crisis support and the emergency measures in the context of the pandemic were initially rolled out. And that does create some differing pathways at the moment. Our primary concern is the global polarity in COVID-19 caseloads, hospital capacity, and vaccination rates. I mean, the harshest scenario from here is that pockets of low vaccination end up as breeding grounds for deadlier or more contagious strains of the virus. Omicron is probably not a good example of that, because Omicron, while being more contagious on the face of it, looks to be more, less dangerous, I guess, from a health point of view. But even, in more benign scenarios, ongoing outbreaks are likely to continue to restrict mobility in some regions and across borders, with potentially long-lasting consequences for labor markets and production capacity. And then different speeds in the recovery will risk exacerbating supply chain bottlenecks. And that, again, I mean, if many countries lag behind, this can hamper progress in dealing with some other urgent challenges, including climate change. So to facilitate the recovery across regions, in the end, economic policy priority number 1, 2, 3, and 4 continues to be to vaccinate the world. Vaccination and boosting remains crucial. That is certainly what we are saying to all of our members, to continue to focus on that.
Some of the labor market issues, at least in the US, we're seeing are related to the public health conditions, but there are also some kind of broader labor shortages or labor mismatch, I guess. And what are your thoughts about how we can tackle that issue as a key risk to the global recovery? Better education and skills development policies, and certainly a more determined effort to reskill, upskill, and skills match. And in the context of this pandemic, I mean, when you see comparatively low unemployment rates in many jurisdictions, and yet, when you see that skills shortage in some areas and high unemployment rates in other areas, I mean, that there ought to be a capacity to better mesh the two, and skills development, better skills development policies, better approaches to education, and indeed active labor market policies have to be a part of the answer there. The Outlook report also cited fiscal trajectories as an issue, less so much the level of debt and more the purposes to which debt is being used. What's your comfort level with the kind of fiscal trajectory in light of all the need for massive spending in many markets around the pandemic? Well,
I mean, in the context of the pandemic, crisis level fiscal support was unavoidable. I mean, it was necessary. There was no alternative. But it's also important not to keep crisis level indiscriminate support in place for too long, while policy needs to remain flexible until the recovery is fully established. I mean, there ought to be an adjustment to the composition of the level of fiscal support. It needs to be more narrowly targeted to those sectors who continue to need that support, and it needs to be focused, on future-focused investment, rather than blanket fiscal support, as was the case in the early stages of the recovery. But as the economy recovers, fiscal consolidation will need to be a focus, because in the end, There are some structural challenges that will also add to fiscal pressure into the future. The aging of the population across many parts of the world will lead to drags on growth in terms of the impact it has on workforce participation, at the same time as expenditure on health, social services and the like related to the aging of the population will increase. And on top of that, it is likely, though that we hope that there's not going to be another shock like the one we've experienced 2 years ago anytime soon, but there will be further external shocks, and there will be a need to build up fiscal resilience to deal with things that might come our way down the track. So as soon as it is feasible, it is going to be important to let some of the impact of stronger growth flow through fiscal consolidation, and to really, in a structural sense, to really ensure that the expenditure side of the budget is appropriately prioritized.
This relates to something I was going to follow up on regarding your comments on subsidies earlier, because about $500 billion in the president's Build Back Better plan relates to incentivizing clean energy technologies, and Business Roundtable supports many of those provisions. But when you think about national steps to spur or incentivize clean energy technologies, how do you do that in a way that keeps a level playing field, that doesn't distort the system, as you were saying earlier?
Well, I mean, one thing that needs to happen is that we ensure that all public policy, when it comes to climate, kicks in the same direction. I mean, to have a whole series of subsidies, like billions and billions of dollars of subsidies across agriculture, industrial, fisheries, fuel, essentially facilitating higher emissions and higher emissions intensity at the same time as we're spending a lot of money on the other side, seeking to lower the emissions intensity in the economy. That just doesn't make sense. I mean, we've got to make sure that the financial flows, public and private, are fully aligned and all kicking towards the global net zero by 2050 goal. It of course can be appropriate for public policy purposes to provide public support, but it should be heading in the same direction. It should be kicking goals in the same direction, not goals in two different directions.
Maybe we can turn to monetary policy, as we're looking toward a higher interest rate environment in the US and to many key economies. What's your sense of the impact that's likely to have, particularly on emerging markets?
Well, look, in the end, again, I mean, central banks have to make judgments based on the information, the data that comes through, and I think they make these judgments very carefully, and the key is really for these judgments to be telegraphed to the greatest extent possible, so that relevant market participants can adjust and position themselves accordingly.
Well, I want to close on one final topic, and then maybe we can let Ken open it up to questions. But Business Roundtable has been spending a lot of time recently around digital transformation. So last week we put out a set of principles developed with dozens of our leading members around responsible use of AI. Can you just talk about OECD's role in terms of addressing risks of digital transformation, and how we can keep OECD countries aligned on the same page around some of the key issues like use of AI?
Well, I mean, we are doing precisely that, and in particular when it comes to AI, I mean, we are facilitating cooperation and engagement across market-based democracies who have a shared set of values, and we are working on putting in place standards on trusted digital connectivity and indeed on appropriate human-centric artificial intelligence. So, I mean, this is an area, I mean, you're right. I mean, there are, of course, with the digital transformation, which has massively accelerated in the course of the pandemic. It was already underway well and truly, but it has massively accelerated during the pandemic. Many obvious upside opportunities from, in terms of e-commerce, teleworking, telehealth, teleeducation, and everything in between, you name it. But of course, also a whole series of evolving and growing risks, challenges, and disruptions, from making sure that there's equitable access to the infrastructure, that there is appropriate education so that all have the best possible opportunity to participate and benefit from the digital transformation, to all the way across to cybersecurity, privacy, tax, competition policy implications. And so across that entire spectrum, I mean, what the OECD does, we bring the best and brightest from governments and stakeholders from all around the membership around the same table, coming up with the best standardized ways to put an appropriate regulatory framework where that is necessary around those sorts of developments. I mean, I guess the bigger challenge is not so much the appropriate standard development within the OECD. I mean, I think that process is well established, and we've done that all the way back since 1980. The bigger challenge is to ensure that we can continue to promote and advance and engage with non-OECD member countries to try and persuade them to join where appropriate those standards as well, so that we can maintain to the greatest extent possible a global level playing field in relation to these issues.
I think that is very important, although I'm encouraged. It sounds like you're optimistic that about the US and the Europe aligning on some key issues. And anyway, is that true? If so, I'm glad.
Look, I mean, one of the issues, I guess, that we're discussing at the moment is how best to ensure data free flow with trust across borders. And I mean, look, in 2022, I mean, that's a very important issue to get that right. If we can't move data swiftly and efficiently across borders, that's going to have a negative impact on trade. And look, there is a conversation within the membership on how we can appropriately recognize, for example, government access provision to data in relevant jurisdictions to make sure that there can be mutual trust and mutual recognition of each other's arrangements in a way that helps facilitate these sorts of cross-border data flows with trust. And that is an area that we're focused on at the moment, but I am quietly confident. I mean, there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of understanding and appreciation of the importance of the work, and we're just working through the practical and the technical issues, in the sort of cooperative way that we do within the OECD.
Well, one final question. What are the key lessons you've learned about the sort of supply chain resiliency? What are the key takeaways we should have from the pandemic about?
Well, I think what is very important is that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, there have been some issues, in particular in more recent times, as the recovery has been very rapid, and that means that demand has recovered very quickly, and supply hasn't necessarily always been able to keep up with the speed of the recovery in demand. And also there have been significant shifts in the structure of demand, and demand structures have shifted much more rapidly than they would at any normal time. And then on top of that, logistics constraints with port closures and the like have sort of further exacerbated the problem. So that has caused some issues. But I mean, overall supply chains have actually been more resilient than is being given credit, being given credit in many of the conversations. And having globally diverse and broadly based supply chains with a bias towards open markets and free trade is very important to our resilience moving forward. And I guess what I would be concerned about is if some of the practical challenges that we've faced in recent times for specific reasons led to a return to a more protectionist posture and a sort of a re-onshoring of excessive levels of production for reasons other than genuine globally open economy reasons. And that's, look, the future. We will see how the future unfolds, and there's certainly going to be some strategic areas where there's going to be some serious thinking. But overall, supply chains have actually held up relatively well in the context of what was a pretty unique set of circumstances.
Yeah, well, that sounds like an excellent note to turn to Ken on.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. We do have a few questions that have come in, kind of following up on some of the themes that you've been discussing already. One of them, has to do, as you discuss recovery, global recovery and supply chains, how well does the OECD work with the other international organizations, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, and to what degree are you trying to coordinate your work on COVID recovery?
Well, we work together very well. I mean, I've got a very good personal relationship with Ngozi at the WTO and with Tedros at the WHO now, and we work on several key projects in those areas together. And look, I mean, in the end, the OECD is an organization that brings together 38 market-based democracies together, and we have an interest in the sustainable expansion of global trade, and we have an interest in helping to support sensible reforms that help to advance that cause. And within the WTO and within the WHO, even as appropriate, we try to be a constructive support.
Very good. Glad to hear it. We'll have people on from the WTO in our next couple of sessions, including from their Trade and Environment Division, and the Deputy Director General, Angela Ellert, will be joining us later as well. So, and I think some of them are on the session now, so they've gotten to hear some of this conversation. Another question that came in, and it didn't really get brought up too much in your opening remarks, but you might want to just, if you could talk a little bit about the role of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in the global economic recovery, what OECD is doing to encourage those, as well as the continued role of digital trade in the global economic recovery. Just any thoughts you might share on those two things. And the specific question that came in from our friends at UPS asks what the private sector might do to help.
Well, look, it's a very important point you raise. I mean, the short answer is the role of micro, small, medium-sized businesses in any economy is crucial. And you talk about digital trade. Well, what I would say, that the one serious issue that we are picking up that can be addressed and that we believe should be addressed is that the take-up of the digital transformation opportunities in micro, small, and medium-sized businesses is quite low. And I mean, the risk is that the big businesses around the world who have who have embraced the opportunities of digital transformation with great vigor will be able to further consolidate and increase their level of dominance. If we want to have the benefits of a genuinely open and competitive market economy, it is going to be important to ensure, with policy settings and otherwise, that the small and medium-sized business part of the economy really continues to keep up with, essentially all that is involved with the digital transformation of our economies, from e-commerce all the way to cybersecurity, and cybersecurity being a real significant and growing exposure there.
Very good. Now, and just in follow-up, we had another question that came in related to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And you discussed a little bit about some implementation issues and complexities with that. Is there any other concerns that you have about countries implementing the changes necessary to achieve what was hoped for in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2?
Well, look, we went through a pretty thorough and lengthy process to get to the agreement, that was signed off at the G20 in Rome in October last year. And in the end, you got to take countries at face value. I mean, 137 out of 140 countries, in the inclusive framework signed on. Every G20 country signed on. Every European Union country signed on. Every OECD member country signed on. And we are now working in good faith with all of these countries to ensure that the implementation can happen swiftly. I mean, there are some issues in emerging economies where we are going out of our way to help on a capacity development front to ensure that they can also stay in touch with where the process is at. But in terms of developed economies that have signed on to this deal, I mean, we expect that everyone now acts in good faith to fulfill the commitments that they made, and I have no reason to believe that that is not the case.
Same here. I'm sure we all agree. So our next panel, as I mentioned before, is going to be dealing with the issues of trade and the environment, and we're going to be. I didn't intend the last pair of questions to be a transition to our next panel, but in some ways, maybe they are. So I'll just read them to you. One comes from Susanna Choi. And she asked, what are your thoughts on the US-EU efforts to establish a green steel club and as part of their steel and aluminum agreement? And a related question, as you look at the cross-border dimensions of climate policies, what can we be doing to better coordinate between countries to achieve their climate goals, ensure that rules-based trade can be harnessed to scale deployment of green technologies and services around the world?
So the answer to the first question is anything that kicks goals in the right direction is a good thing and ought to be encouraged. And so, of course, I welcome any effort, in that direction. And I mean, the second question is really what I tried to address in my answer to the question on carbon pricing before. I mean, climate change is something that really can only be solved effectively at a global level. And decisions that we make in one jurisdictions do have potential spillover effects into other jurisdictions. And if we end up making decisions in one jurisdiction that are commendably ambitious, but just shift activity, jobs, and emissions into other parts of the world where for the same level of output, emissions are going to be higher, well, the planet is no better off. And that just doesn't make sense. But we also got to realize that countries all around the world, all with a stake in this, have different starting positions, different opportunities to make their best contribution, different political circumstances. And so there is inevitably, at this point, a diversity of mixes in policy levers and policy measures that are being used. Over time, you'd like to think that there could be convergence around the lowest cost, most effective way of meeting any given emissions reduction objective. But in order to get there, I think we need better, more reliable, more consistent and more reliable data and information that is reported on a regular basis about the comparative cost and impact of different policy levers that are being used and help inform better decision makings in individual countries around the world and ultimately help to provide a better environment for a multilateral consensus around a globally more coherent, better coordinated way forward. And that's easier said than done. I mean, it's not something that has been done so far, but I think we've got to give ourselves a vehicle to progress that conversation, because ultimately that's what we should aim for. How can we maintain to the greatest extent possible a global level playing field for trade, while at the same time pursuing effectively as necessary our global ambition to get to global net zero emissions by 2050? How do we ensure that we do that in a way that is effective and that is fair, where every country carries an appropriate and proportional share of the burden, but where we minimize trade distortions and minimize carbon leakage risk? I mean, that is a challenge. I believe that our inclusive framework process on tax is a good model to try and bring countries from different perspectives together, making it easy enough for countries to be part of the conversation by not putting the hurdle rate up too high, too early, but taking them through a journey to the sort of level of ambition and effort that is required all around the world.
Mr. Secretary General, Ambassador Silverberg, it has been a real pleasure for us to host you both. Really grateful to you. There's so many issues that you are working on at the OECD that are of interest to the trade community and the business community, and that we are privileged to be the place that convenes those members together, and really grateful to have you with us today. Thank you so very much.